And when it comes to the private creditors, governments can go to the bond markets and issue bonds, which may be privately issued or may be placed directly with buyers. But governments also, instead of issuing bonds on the bond market, could alternatively go directly to a commercial bank and take a loan from a private institution. And similarly, there are other possibilities for private credits. These are much smaller in magnitude, but these are things like export credits or credits from suppliers and so on. Then on the official side, and by official we mean loans that are non-concessional, where if there is a grant element on the loan, it's less than 25%. And the choices here that governments can make is to go to the multilateral organizations, such as the World Bank or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the regional development banks to finance a particular project. Or instead, they might take a loan or approach another sovereign, another government, in order to fund their activities. And these we call bilateral loans, either from governments or their agencies like central banks. And what we've come to see is that the way that governments borrow, both across these major categories and within these major categories, varies over time and across countries. And so here, just for your interest, I'm not really going to be addressing this time series, but just to show you that on the left panel here, we have the value of issues from OECD and non-OECD countries. And you can see that the value of bond issues has varied over time and varies between OECD and non-OECD countries. And on the right panel, we have the number of bonds, number of bond issues between 1990 and 2016 or so. And again, there is variation both across the OECDs and the non-OECD countries and across time. And so there's this lot of variation that we're interested in exploring and interested in understanding. There's another variation, and this is actually our primary variable of interest in this paper, or one of them, is that within private lending, we can look at the ratio between bonds and bank borrowing. And so this is the share of bonds as a share. This is the share of bonds in total private borrowing across countries across time. And you can see that there's variation here. And the bars, of course, represent the upper and lower bounds. Shows that there's variation across countries in any particular year. So there's variation here in the amount of bonds as a fraction of total private credit. Similarly, there's variation here within the official category. That is the ratio of bilateral credit to total official credit. And once again, while there's an interesting trend, there's also variation across time. And within any year, there's variation across countries. And we're interested in understanding what the possible sources of this variation might be. Okay. So let's start with a theoretical story that we might want to tell. And let's think about the supply and demand, perhaps, for sovereign debt. And we'll start with and I'll say from the outset that I think the supply side is, we're going to take, to a large degree, the supply side as a simplified version of the market and focus our efforts and our emphasis a little bit on the demand side. But we can think of a world in which governments, debt managers seek funds for all of the reasons that governments do, whether it's to smooth spending over time, whether it's to invest in long-term infrastructure projects or whatever it might be. On the supply side, essentially, the governments can go to the suppliers of credit and from each receive a price and an instrument, whether the price is the amount of the loan, the interest rate, the currency, the maturity, conditionality. We're going to assume all of these dimensions, in some sense, are simplified into the price of the contract. And each contract is associated with a particular kind of loan, whether it's a bank loan, a bond issue, or a bilateral loan, and so on. And we're just going to assume, to keep things very simple on the supply side, that that in equilibrium, any positive expected value project or a creditworthy state will indeed be funded, and that this aggregate price is essentially equalized across these instruments. Otherwise, there would be arbitrage possibilities on the part of the suppliers. So what we're going to argue that instead, it's on the demand side where there's going to be some variation. That is that the choice that governments are going to make is going to be across the instruments rather than across the prices. And we're going to focus on what the primary concern, or what a concern might be for a borrowing government about which instrument they wish to use. And we're going to focus on this issue of how much information governments have to disclose to their lenders in order to get the loan. What are the informational or the disclosure requirements in order to acquire the loan? And we're going to study this information disclosure requirements along two dimensions. One dimension we're going to call the extensive margin, which we might call the size of the audience. How many lenders are out there? How broadly is the information that the government has to provide about its activities? How broadly is that information likely to spread? And we can think about the intensive margin, how much information is shared, how much information is shared with any specific lender. And that sort of reflects the depth of the requirements, for instance, on policy and current conditions. The kind of information we have in mind here is, what are the current economic conditions? What are the fiscal conditions? What are the international capital market conditions that matter for the borrower? What are the margins? What are the stocks? And so on. All of the things that lenders might want to know about the fiscal and economic conditions of their borrowers before the loans are indeed conveyed. Okay, so we want to think about these different instruments, whether they're bonds, whether they're banks, whether they're bilaterals, whether they're multilaterals, in terms of these two dimensions, that is the extensive margin and the intensive margin, about how much information is going to be released. So let's think about the private market, on the private side first, and let's think about the extensive margin, that is how broadly is information going to be shared amongst the private lenders. And we can think about a private loan from a bank, from a commercial bank. And essentially the nature of that exchange is one where the government and the bank negotiate the terms of the contract, the terms of the loan. Any information that is disclosed largely resides within the confines of the lender, the bank that's doing the lending. Or sometimes the bank is part of a syndicate, which is a set of banks, a small set of banks, information provided to the lead bank that is then shared, narrowly amongst the other members of the syndicate. And that the information that is shared largely stays within the confines of the bank or within the confines of the syndicate. As scholars and researchers, we'd be very eager to find the terms of many of these contracts, but in fact, they're not available, and they are specifically and explicitly kept private, right? And so it's rare that indeed we see the terms of these private loans made public, although there is now a push amongst scholars and academics to have these become more widely available. In contrast, if we compare that with the bond market, if you as a state, as a sovereign, wish to issue a bond, you have a much wider potential set of potential creditors who are going to receive information about your economic conditions. As a sovereign borrower, your debt manager is likely to go abroad, is likely to offer these road shows, which are these slide decks largely about the economic conditions. These institutional investors receive these slide decks. They're shared widely amongst each other. They're actually quite publicly available. And so it's pretty clear that a wider variety of individuals, of institutions, see the information that governments provide when they wish to go to the bond market and issue a bond. So that's on the extensive margin. When it comes to the intensive margin, how much information is revealed along to each of the potential creditors. The bond issues, for example, as we know, in order to issue a bond, you have to satisfy New York or London law, and these require detailed prospectuses. They satisfy severe and significant legal requirements. They run to 100+ pages of country information. As I said, these are publicly available, and they're very, very detailed. So large amounts of information are actually disclosed by states when it comes to issuing bonds. But when it comes to private borrowing, there are very few legal requirements, and the requirements that do exist are simply those that are imposed by the lender. And so they are more relationship specific and likely to be narrower and less intensive in terms of disclosure. And so with that thinking, with that logic, we're going to claim that bank lending requires less disclosure on both margins. And so we'll start with that as a premise for deciding or thinking about how governments might choose across banks versus bonds. So bank lending requires less disclosure. On the official side, right, we can also think about the extensive and the intensive margins once again. And remember, now we're thinking about the difference between borrowing from a multilateral agency, such as the World Bank or the other regional banks or the development banks, as opposed to borrowing directly from another sovereign state. And when it comes to the extensive margin, that is the variety, the breadth of individuals or entities or institutions that are going to receive the information that the governments, the lenders, the borrowers provide, we can think pretty clearly that when it comes to, say, a bilateral loan, there's going to be very few parties involved in those negotiations. Very little information need leak out beyond the two parties that are negotiating the deal. In fact, it can even be part of the conditions of the loan that the information that the borrower provides to the lender may actually remain private. When it comes to the multilateral institutions, of course, there are rules. There are multiple principles. There's the staff. There are public letters of agreement. There are public articles of consultation. There are procedures and processes that need to be followed, that need to be documented, and that are available at the very least to the staff of the bank, to the various members of the bank, and in many instances to the public more broadly, right? And so as a result, we might argue that more individuals or institutions or entities are likely to receive the disclosed information when it is a multilateral loan as opposed to a bilateral loan. On the intensive margin, once again, what about the depth of the information, the degree, the depth of the information that the lenders require? Well, the World Bank, once again, has specific and explicit disclosure requirements. And because of the recent push towards what we call good governance and higher data standards, there is even the requirement for deeper disclosure than in previous periods, that governments actually may have to institute better information collecting techniques and so on in order to provide information to the lenders before the loans can actually be provided. So there's clearly a requirement for a deeper and more detailed information disclosure in the multilateral case, whereas the bilateral case, the lending has often got very little to do with the project in question, may often be geostrategically or politically motivated, and as a result, disclosure when it comes to bilateral loans from another sovereign may indeed be shallower. And so we're going to take as a starting point here that bilateral lending requires less disclosure than does multilateral lending. Okay. With that in mind, we now have to think about the preferences of governments. And what do governments, why might governments care about the information that they wish to disclose? Well, for many of us who watch China and their willingness to censor information, for others of us who live in the United States and we watch governments try to manipulate the social media platforms and other, it's very clear that governments care very much about about what information is disclosed to their publics. There's a wider literature in science that governments care about the perceptions that their voters or their publics have about their competence or their incompetence. There is concern about whether or not corruption may be revealed, and so more information that gets provided may provide opportunities for the revelation of corruption. But also, as more information becomes available, these provide the opportunities for political opposition to politicize particular issues or events, and they create focal points for political opposition that make the opposition, that make the particular issues that emerge politically salient and can be exploited or used as cues by political opposition to mobilize their opponents. Furthermore, we've done a fair amount of work ourselves on the relationship between the degree to which information flows through a polity and fundamental issues of government survival, especially in the developing world. Transparency, which is a term we're going to define in a second, is going to matter for protest, for coups, and for leader survival. If you think about political action generally in any society, political action requires coordination, but it also requires information. And it has to be, and moreover, in order for us to coordinate on political action, we have to share the relevant information that makes us willingness to engage in political action. And that means that the information that we have has to be common knowledge, has to be commonly shared, has to be widely available. So in societies where there is more transparency, and in particular in less democratic states where there is more transparency, we see this ability to coordinate take place, and we see more protest, and we see more political instability. And so information to publics in less democratic societies facilitates coordinated political action that leads to government instability. And so in autocracies, transparency means more political protest and more political instability. How are we going to go in, for example, in democratic states, in contrast, in more democratic states, we show that in fact more transparency makes the electoral process more efficient at removing bad or incompetent leaders from office. And as a result, transparency in democracy reduces the need to go to the streets to engage in political protest and so on. We, of course, are right in the middle of a moment of great political protest here in the United States. And I think there is a link between the willingness of governments to provide information about what's going on and about what they're doing in terms of policy, and this emergent political protest moment that we're in. In fact, I read the newspaper today that the current administration is canceling the semi-annual release of the budget that it normally does at this point, because part of that process is to offer forecasts about what the economy is going to be doing in the next 6 months. And they're claiming that, oh, it's too uncertain, we don't know what it's going to be, so we're not going to offer those forecasts. But rather, I think we're moving into an election cycle where information about bad economic performance would be very damaging to the existing administration in the United States. And so as a result, there's a reluctance to provide economic information about current conditions, which is very much the sort of story that we're actually telling. All right. So we're going to argue, and this is the key point of the paper, that governments which are less willing to share information with their publics will choose debt instruments that require less disclosure. All right. So the idea is that governments have these primitive preferences over how much information they wish to provide, and that these primitive preferences extend both across their publics and to the creditors in general. And this, of course, raises the question, how can we go about, so these are the core hypotheses of the paper. More transparent economies are more likely to borrow in bonds as a share of private borrowing, and more transparent economies are more likely to borrow from multilateral sources as a share of official borrowing. So transparency is going to help us understand the choices within these broad categories. It is still to some degree an open question for us as what might matter for the choices across these broad categories. And that's something. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just jump to our measurements. And how are we going to measure transparency across countries and across time? And here I'm going to rely on some work I've done with two other co-authors, James Hollier at Minnesota and James Vreeland, who's now at Princeton. And I'm going to make reference to a book we published back in 2018 called Information democracy and autocracy, economic transparency and political instability. You don't need to go out and buy the book. You can just dial us up in a number of the journals. We first published our data in a paper in Political Analysis, where we develop an index of transparency. And I'll tell you a little more about how we relied on the missingness of data in order to measure transparency. And we used it, as I mentioned before, to discuss, to explore the relationships between transparency and political survival. We did so in autocracies in an article in the American Political Science Review. We did it for democracies in an article in the British Journal of Political Science. We have a couple of other papers about why governments disclose and who discloses. But today I just want to talk briefly about how we measure transparency across countries and across time. And we're going to make use of something that is traditionally viewed as a problem in panel data, which is the fact that sometimes data is missing. And for much of the modern statistical period, we might say in social sciences, economists have, and social scientists generally, have largely just dropped the missing data on the assumption that missing data is missing at random. And of course, we've come to realize now in the last 5 or 10 years, the data is rarely missing at random. There may be systematic reasons why the data is missing. But for political scientists, we've come to understand that the data actually may be missing for political reasons, right? That is, governments may not wish to have that data made available. Governments may choose to decide what information is made available and what is not. And therefore, to simply assume that the data exists in some objective vacuum, subject to random measurement error, of course, is a bit of a misunderstanding in our view. So what we did is we did something very simple, which is we took the World Development Indicators. This is the set of data variables that are reported to the World Bank by sovereign governments every year, and we took a look at the data set, and we were not surprised to find that for some countries, for some variables, for some years, the data is missing. All right. And so what we did is we wanted to make use of the fact that this data is missing and to consider whether or not the data is missing because governments are choosing not to provide it. And therefore to use this missingness as a way of getting at this latent, unobservable variable, the degree to which governments wish to be transparent. So what we can do is we can look at, say, the most current version of the World Development Indicators. And for any variable J, we've got 240 variables that are related to economic policy and debt. For any variable J, for any country, and we've got 125 countries in our data set, and for any one of the past 31 years from 1980 to 2010, right? We can see whether or not whether or not variable J for country C in year T is present or absent, and we code that as 0 or 1. So we take the entire World Development Indicators and we turn it into a panel of zeros and ones. And then what we do is we want to find this variable we call transparency, such that when we run this logistic regression between transparency and the presence or absence of the data, we get as good a fit as we possibly can. So in some sense, we're going to use a Bayesian iterated process in order to uncover this variable transparency, to discover a potential data set such that when we run this regression, we get a particularly good fit. And this regression has two very interesting parameters that I don't really have time to talk about, but it allows us to consider the fact that some variables, for example, that variables are very easy to collect and are not very politically salient, and therefore governments are much more likely to offer that to the World Bank, and that would have a low difficulty parameter. And there are other variables that are very, very, very useful in determining a willingness to provide information. If it's a variable that is politically sensitive and that is politically sensitive, and governments are usually reluctant to provide it, but if governments do provide it, that tells us a lot about that government's transparency, and that tells us a little bit about, we call that the discrimination parameter. But I don't have time to talk about that, but I will tell you that all of this data, the transparency scores, are available online for anybody to use them at this website, hrvtransparency.org. And there you can play around. You can choose, you can look at all the countries in the world over time, and you can, so this is 2004, and you can see the transparency scores across time for 2004. But you could also plot time series for any particular country. So I've just pulled Mexico out because if I have time, I want to talk about subnational debt in Mexico later on. But here's the national transparency score for Mexico, and you can see that around about 1992, when the PRI finally loses its first election and Mexico enters the realm of democracies as traditionally defined, so does the willingness to provide information, which rises all the way through the 90s and the 2000s. Here's a country some of you might have some familiarity with. Here's Zimbabwe. And what is it, 1994, 1995, I can't remember, is the first contentious election where Mugabe looks like he may actually lose, and suddenly he clamps down on the provision of information about what's going on in that country. And here is South Africa, one of my favorite pictures indeed, because it's sort of very easy to see what's going on in terms of the transparency scores. We have very low transparency during the apartheid period. We have we have Mandela released in 90. We have the first elections in 1994, and we can see that there is dramatic increases in information provision by the government, by the state, all the way through the Mandela period. It sort of slows a bit during the Mbeki period, and then starts to collapse again in the Zuma period. And so you can see that there's a very sort of the measure gives us a clear sense. We think of the degree to which information is available. What I'm going to do is now just take that Mexican graph and take that South Africa graph. I'm going to smooth it, and then I'm just going to compare it to bond borrowing in each of these countries. And so what we have here is the blue line for Mexico. And you can, this picture is for Mexico, and the blue line is that smoothed transparency measure. And the red line, sorry for the messy legend here, is a smoothed measure of the fraction of private borrowing that is in the bond market for Mexico. And you can see that indeed, as transparency seems to be going up, so does the willingness to go to the bond market in order to borrow as a share of total private borrowing in Mexico. And the same is true for South Africa. And again, this is very rough. There's the smooth South African transparency score in blue. And when South Africa once again has access to the international bond markets after 1994, we see that indeed there seems to be a rise in the willingness to use bonds rather than banks when it comes to the share of private borrowing. So some suggestive pictures here. But of course, that's not enough. So let's go and see what the regressions have to tell us. So what we're going to do is consider this baseline analytics here, which is to take a look at, on the left-hand side, the share of bonds in private credit, or the share of bilateral in official on the left-hand side. We're going to use our transparency score as our major variable of interest, a bunch of control variables. So transparency, we have our HRV score. HRV, by the way, for the three co-authors, Hollier, Rosendorff, and Vreeland. Some control variables, country and year fixed effects. And within the control variables, we've got the standard ones: population, GDP growth, foreign direct investment, resource rents, foreign aid, whether or not there's a debt crisis at the time, a bunch of other things. We're going to study just low and middle income countries here. And for our purposes for today, we're going to study these years that I have HRV data for, which is between 1980 and 2010. And very quickly, you can see that when we run this simple ordinary least squares regression here, where we look at bonds as a share of total private credit, the more transparent is the country and the year, the higher is bonds. We've got 86 countries, we've got 1,700 odd observations, and we've done it using these various specifications. What about bilateral borrowing as a share of official? Bilateral borrowing is a share of official. We predict, right, that as you become more transparent, you're less likely to go bilaterally, you're more willing to go multilaterally as you become more transparent. So as you become more transparent here, we see once again that sovereigns are more likely to go to the multilateral agencies as a share of official, or less likely to go bilaterally as a share of official, indicated by the negative signs over here. So you can see that our baseline specification gives us very strong results in exactly the directions that we had anticipated. If instead of looking at the value of the bond borrowing, let's recode the dependent variable as whether or not a country in a year borrows, that is, use a discrete or a binary variable. And once again, we get the same results, that more transparency means you're more likely to have at least one event of borrowing on the bond markets in a particular year. So more transparency, more bond borrowing. And similarly, when we recode on the official side, this in terms of a binary outcome, that is, if there's any bilateral borrowing in that country in that year, more transparency means less bilateral borrowing, just as we had expected or predicted. We might worry that the decision to choose between bonds and banks is in some way related to the decision to go multilaterally or bilaterally. That is, in some sense, your borrowing capacity is constrained, and so how you make these choices are related to each other. And so we ran a series of seemingly unrelated regressions to check whether or not that mattered. And once again, we get significance and we get the signs that we might have expected. Positive signs for bonds and negative signs for bilateral in these various SIR regressions. One thing that Mosley and others, one of my co-authors, has shown to be important when it comes to governments' decisions about how much to borrow, when to borrow, even in what currency to borrow, is this question of what are the conditions in the international capital markets? How liquid are the international capital markets? And we argue secondarily that international liquidity may moderate the effect of transparency. And so what we're going to do is we're going to measure or proxy the degree of international liquidity by the US federal funds rate. And so we might consider that when liquidity is low, that is when the federal funds rates, the interest rates are high, governments have less discretion about how they choose to borrow. That is, they're less able to choose among the instruments. It is only in conditions of high international liquidity where governments have the greater choice and where their preferences over disclosure may become more relevant. And so we're going to use the continuous measure of transparency with a continuous measure of the federal funds rate. But in addition to that, we're going to adopt a difference in differences strategy where we'll recode our transparency score. We'll recode our transparency score to something new, which we simply call transparent, which says that a country year is transparent if their transparency score is greater than the sample average. Okay. And what do we find? Well, the first two specifications are with the continuous measures. We can see once again that more transparency means greater use of bonds as a share of private lending, borrowing, but that the effect is moderated by the federal funds rate. That is, as the interest rates get higher, the effect of transparency shrinks. That is, governments have less of an ability to choose, and transparency becomes less important with high interest rate environment when it comes to the share of borrowing in the bond market. In our difference in difference specification, you can see once again that now in high transparent environments with high federal funds rates, the share of bonds borrowing is going to be lower, exactly as we had anticipated. That is, that international liquidity or the lack of international liquidity moderates the effect of transparency, makes transparency less important in how governments get to choose to borrow in international markets. So international liquidity affects the private side, and it has the expected effects on the bilateral, on the official side as well. Once again, transparency reduces the share of official borrowing that comes from bilateral creditors, But the effect of the funds rate is the federal funds rate of international liquidity is to moderate that effect. That is, the degree to which you have a choice over this matter is reduced when international liquidity conditions are more constrained. And so we see the positive sign on the interactive coefficient there, and the positive sign and our difference in different specifications, saying once again that high federal funds rates or low liquidity moderates or reduces the effect of transparency in the choice to go bilaterally. All right, we have a bunch of alternative specifications. We have looked at, I've shown you the binary outcomes, I've shown you the seemingly unrelated regressions. We could measure transparency simply in terms of economic transparency, the degree to which economic data is made available. We've done that. I can show you those results. We could looked at alternative measures of transparency, that a measure of whoops, I'm back. Did I lose everybody, or are we still here? Hello?
Yeah, you are back. I think we lost connection for 10 seconds or so, no more than that.
Oh, I'm back. All right, sorry. For 10 seconds. All right, let me share my screen once again, 1 second. Ah, there you go. Can you see the screen?
Oh, not yet.
No, share the screen.
Yeah.
There we go.
Back. Okay.
Good.
Go
All
ahead.
right. Apologies for that. Don't know what happened. As I was saying, the results are robust to a variety of specifications, whether we use the different measures of transparency, one that is restricted to purely economic data, one that takes a look at government's willingness to sign on to the World Bank's own disclosure system, the SDDS. We can look at whether or not governments have a freedom of information law in place, another measure of transparency. I can show you what the effect is of transparency on the choice across the major categories. The short answer is not much. And we have some other issues that we can discuss if everybody's interested. I have a couple minutes left, so let me show you whether what we find when we refocus the lens, not across countries, but within a single country, but across subnational units in Mexico. And I'll do this very, very briefly. What we have here, what we notice when we look at Mexico is that indeed Mexican municipalities can borrow, and they can also borrow from different sources. They can borrow, they can issue bonds, they can borrow privately from commercial banks, and they can go to what are called the national development banks. What we're going to do is just compare briefly within the private category, bonds versus commercial banks, and we're going to see whether or not more transparent Mexican municipalities behave in the same way, that is, borrow more in bonds relative to commercial banks. We've got all the Mexican municipalities between 2004 and 2013, that's 408 municipalities, and they borrow on average about 44% of their private credit from bond sources. And I won't tell you how we measured transparency in the Mexican case, but we used a very similar algorithm, a very similar technique to the HRV scores, which was across country. And once again, we get results that are consistent with our expectations. More transparency means that Mexican municipalities borrow more in bonds as a share of their total private borrowing. All right, so there are some caveats we should mention. I mentioned earlier that there may be a problem, at least to some degree, of some endogeneity, in the sense that some official lending actually requires governments to improve their information collecting capacity. And so we should be aware of that. There is some debate as to whether or not our measure of transparency captures, to what degree does it capture government's willingness to provide information, and how much of that variable might be explained simply by a government's capacity to collect that information. There are other things we'd love to have. We'd love to have credit ratings for bond issues, for ratings for how banks rate borrowers. We'd love to know the purpose of the loans. Much of this information is just not available, but these are things that we're going to continue to see if we can find in some form or another. And I think later on, a project here would be, well, if governments are willing to choose across instruments for domestic political purposes, there may well be some price governments are willing to pay in order to go private as opposed to going to the bond markets. But we don't have the terms of these loans, that is the private bank loans. They're just not publicly available. But it would be interesting to see how much governments are willing to pay in order to preserve their opacity. But overall, in conclusion, opaque governments prefer debt instruments that require less disclosure, which means that opaque borrowers prefer bank to bond credit. They prefer bilateral to multilateral official credit, and opaque municipal borrowers in Mexico prefer bank loans rather than issuing bonds. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Happy to take your questions.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I will open for questions now. There are two options for this. Either I allow you guys to talk all at the same time, which is not a good option. Or you can just raise your hand. You just go to the chat option and you can raise your hand. Okay, there is one attendee there. William, okay, go ahead. You have to unmute, William.
Right.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering if there are any countries you found that were outliers that didn't fit.
Okay, let's take more questions, and then if you don't mind, then you address, let's say 3 or 4 questions, Peter. More questions? Peter, I do have a question more related to the way you are estimating your panel. Given the dimension of your panel, so essentially you have 1980, 2010, so you have T equals 30, and then you have on average 85 countries, and you are running static fixed effect regressions. So I just wonder if you're running dynamic regressions with this dimension, you could use GMM, and you would kind of you would address dynamics and a little bit of potential endogenite concerns. Does it make sense?
That's indeed that's absolutely right. We should indeed be doing something along those lines. And I'm sure that, and there's no question that there is a fair amount of persistence in the transparency data as well that we should probably be taking account of. And also, of course, there's things like expertise. Over time, countries have become more familiar with how to access debt markets. And so there are trends and things that we might want to consider in a more dynamic sense. But thank you.
You could perhaps address William's question about outliers in terms of countries.
Oh, I didn't hear it. Can you ask it again?
William, can you unmute yourself?
It's okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Can you hear me? I wanted to know if there were outliers, if there were countries that didn't fit your scheme.
I don't recall. Let me take a quick look. No, I don't recall us confronting this question, but I should go back and check. So I thank you for that. There are certainly, when it comes to the HRV measure, there's a fair amount there's a fair amount of variation across countries, not just in terms of the score, but certainly in terms of things like the quality of the information that's provided. One of the things we don't take account of very much is how good the information that is provided to the World Bank actually is. And so we can think of countries like China, for example, that have a tendency perhaps to provide information that may not be as accurate as information that's provided by other countries. And so we have to be concerned about those sorts of variations. But I don't recall looking for outliers in our particular correlation
Just a
that I
comment.
presented for you today.
Yeah, just
I'll
a
go back
comment.
and check, and I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, just a comment. I think on your seemingly unrelated regressions, I think you can actually go country by country and take a look if to see if any country is an outlier.
Yeah, good idea. That's right.
So there is a question here, Peter. To what extent does the model account for underdevelopment and capability for transparent reporting?
Indeed. So it's quite possible that that our measure of transparency is to a large degree a function not only of the willingness of governments to provide the information, but the capacity of governments to collect that information in the first place, a problem that many less developed countries might actually face. I think that when you look at the raw scores, there's always that possibility. But for the purposes that we've put the data, and in particular in the regressions that we've run, we've attempted to control for a government's capacity to collect information, its capacity to collect, to aggregate, and then disclose information by incorporating various measures of a government's wealth and its income and economic conditions more generally. And so it is absolutely true that simple correlations would hide that, but we think we managed to capture that with many of the controls in our analytics.
More questions, folks? Okay, there is a question here from Tanya. Is there a difference between government preferences for foreign and local currency denominated bonds?
It's a great question. And while we haven't studied that, many scholars out there, there are scholars out there that have investigated exactly that question. The work has a lot to do with the domestic politics and in particular the ideology of the parties in power. The argument is that left parties have greater concerns, say, about employment and about economic growth, and are more accountable to labor, and so as a result want the capacity to issue debt that, if necessary, they can inflate away, and so are more likely to issue in local currencies. Whereas right parties that are, say, more accountable to financial capital, to banks, and so on, or who may wish to tie the hands of future borrowing governments down the line, are much more likely to issue in foreign currency in order because of the political pressures that they're experiencing. What's very interesting about this literature, and I think very important, is to understand that these choices across what look like perfectly generic economic instruments have these major distributional consequences. And so as a result, just in the same way that we think of interest rates as having distributional consequences, and therefore the appointment of a central banker as mattering for the domestic politics, or as a consequence of domestic politics, we might start to think about what are called DMOs, the debt management offices of developing countries in particular, and how these in turn may be subject to political influence and pressure. And they're not just independent agencies or independent actors, but are in fact experience political pressure from their governments, and may indeed respond in terms of choosing the kinds of instruments that they use as a function of the pressures that they experience. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So there is another question here, which I think is related, from Andrea. Does the size and the characteristics of the financial and banking system matter? And I would personally add a little bit more to this, which is, does bank concentration matter for this?
It's a great question. We haven't explored the details, any particular aspects of the banking system. We focus more on economic conditions, including whether or not, for example, the country is experiencing an economic crisis, or whether they're in a recession. But no, we haven't explored this question. It may matter to the degree that the more sophisticated is the banking system, perhaps they might be correlated, I think, with the ability to collect data about economic conditions. And so we'd have to worry a little bit about those two factors. Imagine that countries with more sophisticated financial systems may well be able to make use of that capacity in their debt management offices, and as a result may have more expertise when it comes to going to the international capital markets in order to borrow. But we haven't explored that in particular. It hasn't been part of the analytics that we've investigated.
And there is another question here, Peter. Does the extent of outstanding government debt bonds matter in terms of choice of debt instruments?
Our focus here is on the share of the instruments. When it comes to the absolute levels, I don't have any clear answers to that. I have no doubt that debt management offices, if they are, the debt management offices are concerned about appropriately diversifying their portfolios, and in particular do not want to have bonds, say, all of the same maturity or all expiring or maturing on the same date. And so the existing pattern or portfolio of outstanding debt is certainly going to matter for how and when governments choose to go to the international capital markets. We haven't studied that question, but I will say that we have a new paper that's in the works that addresses a closely related aspect of this, which is inspired a little bit by the recent Argentine crisis and defaults. Debt managers and the treasuries of these countries in particular are very, very concerned about having debt roll over, for example, in an election year. That is, if your debt expires and matures and you need to roll it over, and suddenly the debt markets become unavailable to you, or there's a perception in the credit markets that there is some sort of incipient crisis, you may not be able to roll over the debt. You may not be able to receive the financing you need. And in an election year, that can be particularly damaging to the survivability of the government in power. And so we definitely think that the election cycle, both in terms of when debt is issued, but also when it matures, is going to matter it's going to have political determinants. And in particular, elections are going to matter for that decision. And of course, that's closely related to the existing profile maturities of the existing debt.
Cool. Any other question or comment, folks? So that we still have 2-3 minutes. Nope. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Peter. I think it's been great. Just bear in mind, folks, that the paper is available. This paper is available from ERSA's website and also from Peter's website, I guess. Yeah. And we are recording the webinar. So the webinar will be available also from ERSA's. I think I'm recording this. I hope I haven't forgotten. No, yeah, we are recording.
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
So it's going to be available from ERSA's YouTube channel. And thanks again, Peter, for coming and talking to us. Thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Manuel, thank you. It's been my pleasure, and congratulations on doing this. This is a wonderful thing that you're able to do. So I'm pleased I could participate.
Thank you. Thank you all, and see you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.